It's here, the customized Nintendo Switch Pro controller that I made by hand. And you can buy it now by clicking in the upper right corner, using the first link in the description, or using the link found in the comment section. Now, Nintendo is an ancient company. They have been around for many years, starting new trends but also experiencing hardships. However, after all this time, they've made a bunch of different consoles, with some having very special features. So today we will find out how all of these devices evolved in time, in terms of gameplay, use, story, and design. Now let's start from the beginning, which is so long ago that literally everyone that could possibly watch this video now wouldn't have been alive when Nintendo was created. That's because it was founded as Yamanochi Nintendo on September 23rd, 1889, and was based in Kyoto, Japan. As you can imagine, they didn't make any consoles during this time. Computers weren't even invented back then. So instead, the business produced and marketed Hanafuru, which was a certain card game, and they were all made by hand. For years upon years, they made these cards, and later on went into toys as well, doing great in general. But then, things started to change in 1972. The first commercially available video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey, had a light gun accessory, the shooting gallery. And this was the first involvement of Nintendo in video games. So it all started with an accessory that was very similar to the NES Zapper. They started to work more with that technology and also that console, by securing the rights to distribute it. But then, it all happened. Nintendo started to take their fate in their own hands, by once again starting a new business venture, just like they did some time ago when they also started selling toys. They finally started to see how successful video games were and began to dabble in them. They started developing their own games both for at home and for the arcades. This was a huge step for them. Instead of making some accessories and selling other people's products, they now started to make their own. Because when the 1970s rolled around, a company called Mitsubishi Electric proposed a joint development of a device named the Color TV game machine. They made multiple versions of this device, and it was a home video console created by Nintendo and released in Japan only. In the end, this was a huge success for them, ending up with 3 million sold units of the first 4 models made. Each of them had one or multiple specific games on them, and that was kind of it. To be honest, it reminds me of the plug-and-play consoles. Now, as you can imagine, the games were super primitive. One of them was basically a simple version of Pong. But this was the very start of console making for Nintendo, and right off the bat, they did extremely well. And from this point onward, Nintendo really started to work on big projects that are fondly remembered even now. They made some really popular arcade games at the time, like Radar Scope, Mario Bros, Donkey Kong, and way more, which was really the start of something bigger. Masterminds like Shigeru Miyamoto started making arcade games, and even got to sell them for the Atari 2600, Intellivision, and ColecoVision video game systems. During this time, they also experimented with something else. Something way bigger than any of this. A little handheld device known as the Game & Watch, which Nintendo made from 1980 to 1991. And it was created by game designer Gunpei Yokoi. Now, each of these features a game to be played in addition to a clock and an alarm, being the first Nintendo-only produced console. Now, in general, it was again very primitive and looked a bit like another console they would make later on, the Nintendo DS, although this device could have 1 or 2 screens. Now, this little $20 thing was a major success, with 43.4 million units sold worldwide, which was absolutely insane during that time, and it still is, to be honest. So it was quite a simple thing, but it totally worked, with Nintendo making a fortune on them in no time. However, when this thing really took off, they wanted to take it all a step further. They had more in mind than just simple little playthings. In 1982, Nintendo started to work on a very special prototype system dubbed the Advanced Video System. And this was the very beginning of what would eventually become the well-known NES. It even had similar controllers to it. They made a bunch of accessories such as a tape driver, a joystick, and more, with the whole system being based on a computer. In the end, it was never released, but shortly after, in July 1983, Nintendo did release something else, the Famicom. This was their first attempt at a cartridge-based video game console, and they sold a staggering 500,000 units within 2 months. So really, they did well, making loads of money once again. They were selling tons of Game & Watches, as well as this home console after all. But with this first home console, they also encountered some trouble, and this would be a returning thing. Technology can be faulty after all. For example, they received complaints that some of them would all of a sudden freeze when you tried to play certain games. In the end, they found out it was a specific malfunctioning chip, and Nintendo decided to recall all Famicom units that were currently on store shelves, which ultimately cost them about $500,000. In the end, they made another version of this device called the NES, which was made for the American market. And in the beginning, they tried to distribute it through Atari, but eventually did it themselves. But in the years from 1983 to 1985, a large-scale recession hit video games in America, and so sales fell by 97%. So it was a very risky time. In the end, Nintendo became a bigger player as a lot of American companies met their end thanks to these events. One of the things that caused all of this was quality. It was a big problem, and so Nintendo introduced their seal of quality, giving people confidence again, as well as making toy accessories for it so stores would even sell it, since they were scared no one would buy them. In 1985, they released it worldwide with the fitting accessories being a gigantic success right away, even more than the Game & Watch was, and thanks to the practice of bundling the system along with select games, helped to make Super Mario Bros. One of the best-selling video games in world history, and a huge franchise, with tons of other big games being born on this console as well, like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid. In the end, they almost sold 62 million units worldwide, which helped revitalize the video game industry and set a new standard. Clearly, Nintendo was riding the wave of success very well, getting hit after hit, and their next console would do the same. Because 3 years later, in 1988, Gunpei Yokoi and his team at Nintendo Research and Development 1 conceived a new Game Boy handheld system, with only one purpose, merging the success and strengths of two very successful ideas, the Game & Watch's portability along with the NES's cartridge interchangeability. And so in 1989, it finally hit the market. The Nintendo USA president Minoru Arakawa managed a deal to bundle the popular third-party game Tetris along with the Game Boy, and the pair launched as an instant success. Yet again, they did it. By just innovating, the consumers were hypnotized by the new small console, and so tons of them were sold. Back in those days, handheld consoles weren't really a thing. The only option you had was the Game & Watch. So this new handheld console was a gigantic improvement. You could switch games on the fly, it used the newest technology, and could be taken anywhere. In time they would even improve this concept, making better and better versions, turning it into one of the best handhelds ever made. It's my personal favorite even. So with the 80s being great for them, they had to keep the momentum going. And they did this with a brand new handheld and home console, pushing the limits of technology. Because at the end of an era in 1989, they announced their plan of making a successor to the Famicom, the super version of it. Based on a 16-bit processor, Nintendo boasted significant superior hardware specifications of graphics, sound, and game speed over the original 8-bit version. From the years 1990 to 1992, they started to roll out this system together with its US version. With this console, they would take on Sega, who also wanted to make their own device a hit. But in the end, Nintendo won, even forcing the competitor company out of the console business. It's here! The customized controller I made by hand in beautiful metallic red, with a drip effect on the grips, as well as being signed by me. The whole thing has a multi-layer paint and clear varnish coating, making it extremely tough. And you can buy it now for $169.99 US. A lot of love and attention went into it, and you can check it out by clicking in the upper right corner, the link in the description, or at the top of the comment section. So again, their new main console beat the competition, being the standard in America, Europe, and Japan. And so they continued their path of market domination, announcing their new project in 1993, codenamed Reality, featuring 64-bit graphics. They created it together with Silicon Graphics and was planned to release at the end of 1995. but was eventually delayed. Meanwhile, they made some smaller redesigns of certain consoles, as well as peripherals like the Super NES CD-ROM adapter. And this last one was incredibly important, because it was made together with Sony and then by Philips. In the end, we got the Philips CDI console from this, which wasn't really from Nintendo. But the more important thing is that these events created PlayStation, their biggest rival. They betrayed Sony after all and ended up going with Philips. But the PlayStation was still made in the end. In 1995, Nintendo said they sold a whopping 1 billion game cartridges worldwide. And shockingly enough, of all those they had sold, 10% were from the Mario franchise. Already showing how big of a deal it was and still is for the company. But thanks to their prior actions of betraying Sony, who they had a deal with, the biggest villain in the Nintendo anime was born. Because this Japanese company released the PlayStation 1. This console sold over 100 million, becoming the biggest rival of Nintendo yet, tormenting them for years upon years by beating them in multiple console wars. Meanwhile, they continued their Project Reality, now called Ultra 64, which was coming closer and closer to being released. But before it did, we saw another weird little console from Nintendo that didn't really get far in the end. An affordable virtual reality system called the Virtual Boy, which released in 1995 and was designed by Gunpei Yokoi, who also made the Game Boy as well as the Game & Watch. It consisted of a hand-mounted, semi-portable system with one red-colored screen for each of the player's eyes, featuring stereoscopic graphics. You just look through the binocular eyepiece and control your character using the attached gamepad. Now, I have actually tried this thing before at the Retro Spielmessen in Norway, and it was actually quite fun. And back then, critics were disappointed with the quality of the titles and red-colored graphics, and I gotta admit, I agree with them to an extent. It had something going for itself, but it was too weird and certainly induced headaches. In the end, it sold poorly and was quietly discontinued, which makes them quite rare nowadays, as you can imagine. Now, the next thing on Nintendo's agenda was the Nintendo 64, which was originally called Ultra 64, and this led to some problems. They realized they had mistakenly chosen a name for their new console that the Konami Corporation owned the rights to, and so the name was changed. In the end, it was released in 1996 and was their third home console, launching with 4 games: Super Mario 64, Pilot Wings 64, Saikyo Habu Soigi, and Shadow of the Empire. Now, this was a legendary console with many cult classics like Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Donkey Kong 64, and more. All of these games are rated highly and were extremely well designed for being the first real 3D games Nintendo ever made, which was also the big selling point of the whole console. 3 dimensions to completely take in your surroundings and create the highest level of immersion possible. And they pulled this off rather well, with the whole experience being solid, especially the gameplay. But the controller was a bit odd, to say the least. Now, this new game-breaking technology they were hoping to make millions on didn't really make the return on investment they were hoping on, because they sold 32.9 million of them, which may sound like a lot, but their previous one sold a whopping 49.1 million. Clearly, this new exciting device with amazing games didn't sell that much, while their new rival, PlayStation, got over 100 million of their new devices in people's homes. Clearly, Nintendo was beaten. Luckily enough, they could always rely on their handheld systems performing excellent, so they released the Game Boy Pocket, a smaller version of the original. It was designed by Gunpei Yokoi as a parting gift, adding another strong addition to their selection. No one was even coming close to beating their handhelds, so of course they sold heaps of this redesign as well. But the designer who helped Nintendo make this great machine went on to help a competitor as well, so Nintendo came up with an even better version. In 1989, they introduced the Game Boy Color, its successor, with one new, mind-blowing feature for a handheld: a color screen and even more power. It was made to compete with the Wonder Swan Color, which Gunpei Yokoi helped made, and the Neo Geo Pocket. Of course, it was a great success and easily beat the competition, partially because of Pokemon Silver and Gold, which were the best-selling games for it. So while the home consoles of Nintendo were doing quite awful for their standards, handhelds became a bigger and bigger part of their revenue. So after sliding 14.5 million of these babies across the counter, they took the whole Game Boy experience to the next level. The glorious Game Boy Advance, my favorite version of this console together with the SP. This one truly took handheld games, in general, a step further. The colors were even more vibrant, graphics had improved a millionfold, and the cartridges were a lot smaller now. And the screen was in the middle with the controls on the side, making it even more streamlined. And I could still play all the old games as well, making it the perfect version and a favorite for many. Selling even more than the previous type as well, with the Game Boy Advance series landing in over 81 million hands worldwide. Clearly these were doing well and Nintendo started to make more and more stuff in a shorter amount of time, which is probably due to technology moving faster and faster, forcing the company to make new consoles more frequently. The next move for Nintendo would be a new home console. The last time they released one was 5 years ago after all, and it wasn't doing that well. And so a different type of console was made and released, using different technology as well as improving the controller after learning a lot more from their first 3D experiment. The Nintendo GameCube, which released in 2001. It was known as Project Dolphin and was incredibly compact compared to all other consoles of that generation. It was the first game console to use optical discs rather than game cartridges, which was a huge shift for them. Now the reason why they most likely did this is because the PlayStation had discs as well, which ended up having some big advantages when it comes to production compared to old cartridges. Although they did use a different kind, a smaller one. Mostly because it would make piracy harder, be cheaper, and would save on licensing fees. But they hold less data, so some games required 2 discs even, which was quite a big downside. The console was mostly banking on sequels of Nintendo classics like Smash, Super Mario, and Zelda. In general, it looked quite good for the GameCube. The games for it were solid, the controller was a huge improvement, and it was even the most powerful console of that generation. Now, all of this sounds really good, however, it wasn't good enough, because they only managed to sell 21.7 million of them, which was even lower than the previous, while their biggest competitor PlayStation sold a whopping 155 million units, which is an absolutely crazy amount to be honest. Hey, psst, little side note. We got some cool Dr.Wily merchandise that you can buy right now. It's almost Christmas after all. So that's a great excuse, don't you think? You can find it by clicking in the upper right corner, using the link in the description, or even the top pinned comment. So go check out those lovely shirts, sweaters, and other stuff, and get something cool before the end of the year. Now let's continue. So they went from being the king of video games to being the number 2, and only really winning in the handheld department. And with their Game Boy line coming to an end with the release of the Game Boy SP and Micro, which were just the latest enhanced versions of the older devices, with one being smaller and the other having a clamshell design, they had to move on. And so Nintendo wanted to do something new, fresh and exciting after all of this. The Game Boy era was over and the home consoles needed some sort of edge to win from PlayStation. Thanks to that, they started to go back to some old concepts and added features to the console no one ever expected. A bit like the Virtual Boy, but better. And so in 2004 they announced plans to release a new brand of handheld, unrelated to the Game Boy, the DS, featuring 2 screens, a bit like the Game & Watch. And one of the screens was touch sensitive. In addition to the touchscreen, it also created 3-dimensional graphics similar to those of the Nintendo 64, with some other smaller features being added as well, like a microphone, Wi-Fi, and more. This whole device was wildly different from the Game Boy seen in the past, being partially based on an older console, as well as doing some new things no other company had done. And down the line they did some minor redesigns like the DS Lite, DSi, XL, and more different versions. These were just updates, but didn't drastically improve the device, like the other Game Boy versions did. In the end, this gamble did pay off, selling almost as much in its lifetime as the PlayStation 2 did. Clearly, the tables were turning. The new, more risky strategy paid off, and their new console was a gigantic hit, with nothing else surpassing it in the years to come. And this isn't where it ends, because they had a similar approach to the next home console they were making. At E3 in May 2005, Nintendo displayed the first prototype for their new generation system, codenamed the Nintendo Revolution. And this device was of course the Wii, which was released on November 19, 2006, changing the gaming landscape for good. The whole thing was designed to appeal towards a wider audience than those of its main competitors. It was made for casual gaming. You know, people like young kids, families, grandparents, and of course the classic Nintendo fans who buy almost anything they release. And there was one thing they added to this device to lure in those people. A feature that seemed like witchcraft to some: motion controls. Using the Wii Remote controller, it can detect motion and rotation in 3 dimensions, using a mixture of internal sensors and infrared positioning. And it included an accessory port that can be used to connect other accessories, such as the nunchuck, which gave you the analog stick and some other buttons. Now this console was a bit weird and didn't always work as well. However, it was a gigantic success, just like the DS, selling over 101 million units, making it the most successful home console of the company's whole history. And there was one terrible and odd thing about the console that really stands out after their failure with the GameCube. The internal hardware is an updated version of that previous console. In comparison, the Wii had lower power and didn't even output in high definition. It was trash when it comes to specs. But thanks to special features and adding games to it like Wii Sports, which was its killer app according to the mainstream audience, along with others like Mario Kart, it was successful. And so for years Nintendo was the king of the gaming industry, coming back out of the darkness by being innovative, which became their plan from now on. If you can't beat them, then do something completely different that no one else is doing so they can't beat you at it. The company hit a high in terms of profits, and their share price on the stock market also hit a gigantic high. So what would be next for the Japanese Wonder Boy? Would their next console idea be a bestseller as well? Yes and no, because they made the next generation of their previous consoles, adding some completely new features to it. They made a device similar to the DS. It's called the Nintendo 3DS, which was released on February 26, 2011. Now this time the 2 screens and touchy stuff wasn't the gimmick that helped Nintendo sell them, but actually the wondrous world of 3D. It had 3 cameras, 2 on the outside for 3D photographs, and an internal one above the top screen. And the upper screen was also able to create 3D depth effects, a bit like 3D movies in the cinemas. But you don't need special glasses to see it, and that's thanks to audio stereoscopy, which is a process that sends different images to the left and right eye to enable you to view the screen in 3D, which was an extremely interesting and quite revolutionary technology, and this showed everyone that Nintendo had a plan of attack. After their experiments with the Wii and DS becoming a huge success, they learned that having the most powerful console isn't that important, but actually having a product that stands out, or even doesn't compete with any others at all because it's so different. To be honest, this philosophy is perfect for Nintendo, since they were quite creative after all, and it was even proven during the GameCube and Wii era. When you think about it, they were already thinking out of the box with devices like the Game Boy and Game & Watch, but now they finally fully accepted this. Now of course, almost everyone was interested in this new handheld with quite a unique gimmick, and I totally get why, because the 3D effect worked well for the most part. Sure, some people didn't like it or couldn't handle it for a long time, but there wasn't really anything wrong with it. But in the end, something did go wrong. Nintendo didn't really do a whole lot with the 3D effect of this console. In the trailer, it was a big selling point, but not a whole lot of games actually made use of it, which is a bit of a shame. Now later on, they made newer versions of it just like they did with the normal DS, making it bigger and better by adding things like a faster CPU, a C-stick, or just a straight up bigger screen. With another version known as the 2DS hitting the market as well, which was basically a cheaper and simpler version. In the end, this was another massive hit for Nintendo, selling over 60 million of them. So with the handhelds flying off the shelf, they had to come up with a new gaming system for in the living room. And so on June 7, 2011, it was announced, being known as the Wii U, which was their first console capable of 1080p HD. And during their press conference, they put a great amount of stress on the abilities and innovations of the new controller, a unit resembling a tablet. Sadly enough, many gamers were confused after this. Was it a new system or just a new controller for the Wii? Which was already a bad sign. Now this new controller had a 6.2-inch touchscreen, 2 thumb pads, 4 shoulder buttons, a directional pad, and 4 lettered buttons. It also featured an accelerometer, gyroscope, camera, NFC scanner, and a built-in microphone. However, while it was quite a unique device, 3 things went wrong with this console in the end. First of all, not every gimmick works. The tablet was not a hit with customers. Most found it very clumsy to use, looking low quality, and there were no games for it that even used the new controller in an interesting way. So clearly, making something odd that stands out isn't necessarily a win all the time. But that's not all, because the second issue was confusion. Way too many people thought this was the next phase of the Wii's success, but it was actually a completely new thing. So thanks to that, a lot of people didn't know what the plan was and what they were getting into at all, which was another big problem. And now we get to the final point. There weren't enough games for the freaking thing, which didn't help people to justify buying this. Also because it was really odd. And so in the end, it did terrible, which was a huge blow to Nintendo's wallet as well as ego, especially after the huge success of the Wii. In the end, only a total of about 13.5 million Wii U's were sold, it's just not enough. Even the GameCube didn't perform this poorly, so they were having some mixed results with this generation of devices, with the 3DS doing quite good and the Wii U terrible. With all of this happening, they would have to come back swinging in the next console era, and they actually took a massive risk this time. On October 2016, Nintendo revealed their biggest gamble so far, a system called the Nintendo Switch. It was a big risk because it was a hybrid system, with detachable controllers, with an emphasis on portability and on-the-go multiplayer. As you can imagine, this would make handhelds like the 3DS and Game Boy a lot less useful, and at times these consoles saved the company from gigantic losses. So this safety net was gone. Really, there was a lot that could have gone wrong here. But luckily enough, Nintendo learned a lot from their previous console. So they put a lot of effort into marketing. And in the year it was released in, Nintendo put out Zelda Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey, both of which were huge successes and helped sell millions of the units in the first year of the new console. And so it became more and more popular, with all of it going even faster when the crossover fighting game Super Smash Bros. Ultimate came out. So this time they made sure everyone understood what the console was supposed to do and chose a fitting name for it as well. The trailer was a great example of how they marketed it in general, with the iconic Switch click helping a lot as well, making the transition between home console and handheld very clear. And so far the console is a huge success, with more than 41 million units being sold so far. So their gamble paid off. And of course they made another version, known as the Nintendo Switch Lite, which has a more confusing position in the market, being smaller than a normal Nintendo Switch and also quite a bit cheaper, but you can't put it in a dock. Now we will have to see how this device does in the long run, since it hasn't been around for that long, but its purpose is already a bit more vague. So overall, Nintendo has experienced a lot with their devices throughout the years, sometimes ending in failure and other times in great success. But still, at times they've changed the gaming industry permanently, and who knows what this Japanese giant will do next. It's here, the customized Nintendo Switch Pro controller that I made by hand. And you can buy it now by clicking in the upper right corner, using the first link in the description, or using the link found in the comment section.